In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy DMG in America, Japan, and then in the following year, 1990, released it in the UK and Europe. This system was not released in China, at least until around half a decade later. Here's the story why. Stick around. Gaming consoles had been banned in China up until as recent as 2015. However, thanks to a loophole in the Game Boy being a portable system, headway was made and the Game Boy was able to achieve a limited release in the country. Nintendo allowed via a Chinese manufacturer named Mani, that's spelled M-A-N-I, to produce and sell the Game Boy brand as a bribe proxy, therefore introducing mainland China to legitimate Nintendo portable gaming, unlike a lot of the piracy up until that point that has been very prolific even up to this day. Through this collaboration, under about something said as 10,000 systems were produced and sold, along with a handful of various game titles, including this one you see here, which is Burger Time for the Game Boy. The Burger Time Pocket or Burger Time Deluxe, however you want to call it. Today I want to share a few of them, and I have in my collection here, and to show the differences that would otherwise be considered Nintendo released ones that were more commonly known to see. So as you can see, I'm playing a copy here of Burger Time. Doesn't look any different from what you'd be used to seeing in American or Japanese or UK release. However, there are some differences here. It's just a lot of the differences are under the hood, so to speak. And what we're going to do is we're going to show you right now, because this here is the Chinese version of Burger Time for the Game Boy. I'm going to shut this off and I'll flip this over. And the first thing you're going to notice is the label here. Now the label looks pretty similar to what you'd see on an American copy of the game. Not necessarily the Japanese version. No, the Japanese version is a totally different creation with some live action photography of a model holding a burger bun, which is really adorable actually. So I'm going to put up a American copy of the game right here, a North American copy of the game. And to the right, you're going to see the Chinese version. Now, there's a couple obvious things right off the bat. You can see the logo, a lot of the the artwork itself is a little more shaded over here compared to the American copy. But however, you also look a little closer, you'll notice it says here, focus, made in China over here in the corner. And you'll see some Chinese lettering. You also see some Chinese lettering up here, which I assume is translation of this side out. The American copy, you have made in Japan. You can see even USA listed there. No Chinese writing. Now, first thing you might think is, oh, this is some Chinese bootleg pirated copy of the game. Because up until this point, who wouldn't blame you, right? So much Chinese piracy and product comes from China. So looking on the back here, you're going to also notice something a little more obvious as well. Made in China. As per the difference in the made in Japan that we're so used to seeing, even on American copies of games for the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to take these apart. I want to show you some of the differences in the games. I'm going to take these screws out real quick. And we'll put them aside here. So first up, we're going to see the American board here. Now the American board, nothing too interesting about it really. It's the same exact board we're used to seeing, a board that takes up a majority of the inside casing of the cartridge. Yeah, it's a nice square board. Nothing really too fancy about it. Outside maybe a Pokemon game having a battery here, maybe a little slightly enlarged circuit board, depending on the game. But for the basic Game Boy cartridge, this is more or less the typical board you're going to see. However, things change a little bit when we flip over to the Japanese version. And the only reason you couldn't see the difference would be if you're totally unfamiliar, but I think most people can see the difference right off the bat, even if you're not up to game with the system in general. This board is just completely different here. It's like a whole chunk of it's been chopped out. But the big thing is you'll notice a blob chip over here. Blob chips are notorious for being in pirate cartridges. That said, it's not necessarily you're going to see a pirated cart, and you can see these in legitimate cartridges as well. It's just very, very slim chances of that. There's some copies of Tetris in America that have the blob chip. I believe it's due to just the manufacturing process at the time that Nintendo was trying to release these cartridges and get them out into the market. Much like early on in the Nintendo's life, the Nintendo Entertainment System in America, they were using Famicom adapters in the cartridges and putting literally Famicom cartridges inside an American cartridge because they wanted to move stock. They didn't want to need to keep up with demand, and they wanted to get everything on the market. I think a similar thing is going on here. Not necessarily with the Japanese or the Chinese cartridge necessarily, but the fact that American cartridges will sometimes have the blob chip, most likely in like Tetris. But for the most part, yes, this blob chip would represent a pirated copy of a game. But not so for the Chinese version. So some little things I want to point out here. You'll see that the chip still says Nintendo, DMG. But on the back, when you flip it around here, you'll see the company logo for Mani, M-A-N-I. And that was the company that Nintendo had allowed to manufacture these games and the Game Boy, and I believe Game Boy Pocket systems in China during the mid-90s, around 94, 95. So it took it half a decade for it to make it over to China, the system. Now, these cartridges are kind of, I don't want to say rare necessarily, but they are very uncommon. If you happen to see any, I would definitely grab them and pick them up. I happen to come across them here and there just by chance. I'm going to show you the few that I've collected over the past so many years here. Burger Time is one of my favorite Game Boy cartridges, one of my favorite games on the system. Yeah, in my opinion, it's probably the best version of Burger Time, even better than the arcade game. It's just a lot more friendlier to play. Controls are a little easier to get the grasp on. Now, in China, there was a very limited run of what games were available through Mani to produce the library. You're not going to find every single game in the Game Boy library in China. I don't have a list in front of me, but if I'm not mistaken, it was something around 50 to 60 games. There are lists online that you can look up, and I'll see if I can link one down in the description below. But for now, I'm going to show you the other cartridges I have. I think I have 4 total. This one here, which was very interesting because when I was out in Arizona, I was visiting friends. I found this at a Bookman's. And I didn't know it at the time. I mean, this was probably about, I think it was the first trip I went out there. It was about 13 years. No, at this point, it would have been 14 years ago. And I didn't really notice anything about it. I honestly thought if for some reason, just looking at these letters off the top of my head, I thought it was maybe a Japanese version of the cartridge before I realized the artwork up until this point was a lot different. At that time, I didn't see a ton of Japanese games to really realize it. And obviously made in China, I just never really crossed my mind that what I had here was a Chinese version of the Game Boy Donkey Kong game. Now, here, let's take this one open because this one is a little different. Like I was saying earlier, depending on the game and if it uses a battery, which this game does, you're going to see some differences here from the other Chinese board that I just had out. You can see we get 2 blob chips, and this is a battery I ended up having to put back in. The battery is long dead on this. But if we take it out, you're going to see at the top here, Mani. So it was an interesting learning lesson for me to discover this over the years, that this whole to do with Chinese gaming in Japan and how it was banned in China all this time. From what I understand, it's as recent as 2015 that the games have been kind of allowed to be distributed and played in China. If anybody has any more information they want to share, please feel free to leave that in the comments, because I'm always open to learning more about this. So that was my first game I found that was a Chinese variant of the game. Burger Time, which I had already shown you, I actually found on eBay really cheap, because I think a lot of times people don't realize, much like I did with the Donkey Kong game, that these games are a bit of a difference, and just they're not the typical game to see. So they think it's just, hey, it's just a Game Boy game. It's Burger Time. I'm just going to put it out for sale. But on the secondary market to hardcore collectors, these Chinese games are a whole nother subgenre of collecting in themselves. So for the most part, there's some demand involved. Another one I picked up was Elevator Action. I had always wanted to own this for the Game Boy, and when I saw it on eBay for actually less than a typical North American release of the cartridge, I jumped right on it, because not only is it a game I wanted to own in my collection, it's a very nice copy of it, as you can see, and it's the Chinese variant. I think they're fascinating. I'm going to put that over there. Most of the time, the artwork's the same, other than some variables. I showed you with the Burger Time and the darker logo there. Here's another example of a different in logo. I don't have the American copy handy, and I apologize for that. I didn't do my homework, because I do have an American copy of this. But you can see here we have some Chinese writing and letters underneath the logo of the game. And in this case, Side Pocket's American release, this kind of sky looking bluish background here is a lot lighter. It almost looks like a more of a day instead of a night scene behind the balls here. And once again, you get made in China, you get the Chinese lettering. This one here I found for $5 of all places at the local farmer's market, which is insane. There's a dealer over there who has tons of video games and action figures, and he has a little rack of Game Boy cartridges that you can just kind of flick games off of. And I had actually done a double take on this one, because I said, oh my gosh, this is a Chinese copy of Side Pocket, and in great condition as well. So I was always a big fan of this game too. So anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say at the moment about these games. If you'd like to, like I said, leave a comment below if you have any other information. I'd like to hear about it, especially if you're from China and maybe you remember collecting these as a kid, maybe when they were coming in, to being found. I just think it's pretty interesting history overall for the Game Boy system. And anyway, thanks for joining me today, and I appreciate it. I will see you next time. Thanks again. Take care.